scheduled it for today to have Quinn to come and to speak for us in a regular service, and that worked out better anyway, and we're glad to have him here with us today. We've known the Murphy family for a long time. I have first came to know them through my son, and he married Quinn's sister, and we got acquainted with them that way. As I said before, Quinn and his family attended church here for a long time, for years, before moving over across the river. But Quinn is an excellent man. He's an attorney, as you know, with Sandberg Phoenix Law Firm, and a very excellent individual all the way around. But he was diagnosed with cancer in 2017, I think it was, and this came as quite a shock. Stage 4 lung cancer, and of course our church and others besides us, of course, began praying and crying out to the Lord for healing for Quinn, and he is now 3 years clean of cancer, and that's a tremendous blessing. But through this, he started a blog called Lion Strong and posted messages on there periodically. And they became quite a blessing to all of us who were keeping up and reading them, glorifying to the Lord and praising the Lord through this entire thing. Certainly before he knew that the Lord was going to heal him of the cancer, he was already writing these, and they became a great blessing to us. But anyway, we wanted to have Quinn to come and to not just share his testimony, but whatever he would like to do this morning by way of bringing the gospel. But it's good to have him here in our services, and we welcome him to the pulpit, and we're quite sure that what he has for us will be a great blessing. So hold him up in prayer as he comes to bring us what the Lord has given him for us today. Brother Quinn, would you come, please?
Good morning, everyone, on this cold February morning, even colder than I thought it would be when I got out of bed this morning. And around our house, the way it works is I'm always hot and my wife's always cold. I know that's not the case with any of you, but this morning we were both cold, so I think she thinks I finally came to my senses. This morning, I appreciate you having me out to talk about 10 things that I learned during my battle with cancer. And as Tom mentioned, we went to church here for many years, but when we moved over to Illinois, we haven't been back, just because we have a new church over there, and we attend there regularly. But I was here 2 or 3 weeks ago, I believe it was, to hear my nephew, Christian Henry, preach. And I remember after that sermon, he gave an excellent sermon, joking to Pastor Tom that what we were witnessing that evening might actually have been the culmination of years of planning by a young and very politically savvy Christian Henry. That unbeknownst to Pastor Tom that evening, Christian might have been waging a coup to steal control and power over this very pulpit, even from his unsuspecting grandfather. And that if Christian's coup was successful, the last 2 sounds Pastor Tom might hear from this beloved sanctuary just might be the click of young Christian's hands locking the door behind him and discarding the key into the trash can, and then the soft hum of Christian's wheelchair as he rolled back toward this newly secured pulpit. I can tell you this morning I'm glad to report that coup never materialized, and to ease Pastor Tom's mind that this pulpit will be safe and sound after this morning as well, I promise you. I'm not a preacher. I've never preached a sermon in my entire life. I've spoken to folks before in my profession. I'm an attorney. I do go to court and argue motions and try cases. I've spoken to individuals about my experience with cancer, which I'll elaborate on here in a moment. And I, maybe a year ago, spoke to a small group of teenagers at a different church in Columbia, not even mine, about my battle with stage 4 cancer. But I've never preached, and I can confirm to you this morning that standing in front of you may be the most intimidating place I've ever stood and been asked to speak. So bear with me. It's not what I do, but I'm really excited to tell you about what God's done in my life. And I'm thankful to have the opportunity to stand here this morning and talk about the 10 lessons about God that I learned during a very trying time just a few years ago. My relationship with this church goes way back, as Tom reported. My wife and kids moved to St. Louis about 20 years ago, actually just my wife and I at the time. And we had gone to church at a Baptist church in Ozark, Missouri. And I grew up in Springfield, as we'll talk about here in a moment, but Ozark's a small town. It's much bigger now, but at the time it was a small town. And we were a very small church, predominantly farmers. And so my recollection, Jennifer, maybe you think otherwise, but that like a packed house was 12 people. And most Sundays we would be lucky to get 7 or 8, particularly if one of the farmers was dealing with his cattle or crops or something of that nature. So I asked my pastor in Ozark if he knew of any good churches in St. Louis, because we knew we wanted to get established and locked in. And he knew Pastor Moore at the time. And he said, try Bible Baptist. And we came here, and it ended up being the only church that we ever tried. We just stayed. So we lived in the city at the time, and it was a really important and good, fruitful and profitable time in our lives, both as a family and spiritually. We had both our kids while we were attending Bible Baptist, and I attended law school while we were at Bible Baptist. A good portion of our lives was spent at Bible Baptist, and so I certainly respect this church and am very appreciative and honored to speak here today. I know, because my sister would tell me while I was battling cancer over the last few years, that every Sunday I was prayed for, and, that meant a lot. And, we felt it. And I thank you for that. I want to start with reading a letter from a medical professional dated June 13th, 2017. I write to confirm the medical history and oncology prognosis of Mr. Quinn Murphy. Mr. Murphy presents as a 6'5", 230-pound Caucasian male with no family history of cancer or related medical condition. On March 3rd, 2015, Mr. Murphy underwent a preventative colonoscopy at his primary care physician's direction. Having experienced no prior symptoms, Mr. Murphy was doing exactly what a prudent medical provider would recommend. Schedule a colonoscopy before exhibiting any symptoms so that any signs of colorectal cancer could be identified and treated early. When identified and treated early, colorectal cancer is one of the most survivable forms of cancer there is, with a 95% chance of recovery. That chance of recovery decreases significantly and dramatically if early detection is not accomplished and the cancer is left to spread unchecked. Once the cancer has spread to a patient's liver and lungs, to the extent it has in Mr. Murphy's case, a patient only has a 5% chance of survival. The colonoscopy performed on Mr. Murphy revealed a polyp of the descending colon, which was resected and reported as endocarcinoma, moderately differentiated. Upon receiving this report, Mr. Murphy's physician did not order a CT scan, didn't refer Mr. Murphy to a surgeon, and did not recommend related treatment. Instead, when confronted with signs of early-stage colorectal cancer, Mr. Murphy was advised to come back for another colonoscopy a year later, giving the cancer time to grow and spread unchecked. Mr. Murphy followed the instructions of his physician and returned 1 year later on May 31st, 2016 for another colonoscopy, which presented his physician with yet another opportunity to catch and treat his order immediate medical treatment. Instead, for reasons that defy explanation, Mr. Murphy was given a clean bill of health and simply told to schedule another colonoscopy, this time in 5 years. Mr. Murphy did not have 5 years to wait. Within the next year, he began to exhibit concerning symptoms that caused him to immediately seek care from another medical professional. Unfortunately, by that time, the cancer in Mr. Murphy's body had spread to his liver, lungs, and was fully metastasized in his entire bloodstream. Ultimately, the failure to catch and treat Mr. Murphy's cancer early were the direct cause of Mr. Murphy having a condition with a 5% survival rate at the time of treatment instead of a condition with a 95% survival rate at the time of treatment. Having reviewed Mr. Murphy's medical file and based on 40 years' experience as an oncologist, this is effectively the difference between almost certain survival and almost certain death. Going forward, Mr. Murphy will require constant checkups, extensive tests, and more likely than not, additional surgeries, all for the purpose of doing everything possible to avoid recurrence. And even with these preventative measures, the likelihood of a recurrence borders on a near certainty. Mr. Murphy is the sole provider of his family. More likely than not, Mr. Murphy will reach a point in the next few years where he can no longer work or earn an income for his family. Mr. Murphy's medical surgeries have left him with scars and a constant lack of energy, which will only decrease with time and the almost certain recurrence of cancer. Mrs. Murphy has had to take on the burdens that were once his. She and their children will also have to live every day with the fear that the cancer will someday return and they will lose a husband and a father well before his time. The challenges of Mr. Murphy's future, once a distant possibility, are now all but a scientific certainty for Mr. Murphy and his family. That's a tough letter to read, even today. I can assure you that was a really, really tough letter to read at the time when I was in the middle of this. I remember reading this letter and hearing what he had to say about my future and just thinking to myself, how can this be me? I mean, I read about people that this happens to, people that go through challenges like this and cancer hits them out of the blue, but that isn't you. That isn't me. How can this be me? I was 45, 46 at the time. I was healthy. I ran, I exercised, I had some knowledge of nutrition, tried to be intentional with my diet. I had a promising future. I had 2 young kids that were on the verge of their teenage years, which, as we all know, is a time you really want to be there for them. I just couldn't believe it was happening. I couldn't believe what this man was telling me. And I didn't understand how I had come to this point in my life where I was being told that effectively I am going to die of cancer. How do you receive that, right? I mean, we think about it, or maybe we don't think about it. I didn't know anything about cancer. And when I got this prognosis, it was, needless to say, really tough to swallow. So my biggest question was, how did I get to this point? And I think to understand my story and to understand how I got to this point, we actually have to go back. And we have to go way back to my start. I was born in Springfield, Missouri. I am the son of 2 artists and musicians. I got into sports at an early age. Pretty much tried everything, but soccer was kind of my favorite at the time. I wasn't a particularly big kid, but I enjoyed playing soccer with my friends. And later I picked up a basketball and kind of fell in love with the game of basketball in elementary school and started to play and work on it with my dad. I was always pretty skilled at basketball, but I was never the biggest kid. I grew late. And so, for most of my junior high and high school years, I was a small kid that could play but wasn't really the most physically intimidating kid on the court. Now, I've always been a big Oklahoma Sooner football fan, which I'm sure either you are or someday will be, with the exception of the Henry family, perhaps. But in junior high, I decided I was going to try the game of football. I'd watched it for years and years with my dad. It looked like so much fun. You know, I'm watching all these legendary Sooners play, and I remember, you know, I loved to sit there and watch plays happen in slow motion, and running backs jump over this pile, and they look like they're hanging in the air for a year. And I remember that first day I tried out for the football team in 7th grade. We were the Jarrett Trojans. We had these emerald green uniforms, and first day of practice comes around, and we get our uniforms, and my coach at the time, his name was Coach Mike Hunter, really great guy, good Christian man, and Coach Hunter gave us our jerseys and our pads and, you know, helped us figure out how to put them on. I hadn't played like Mighty Mite football or anything, so I didn't have a clue. And I put this jersey on, and it's just like I saw on TV. I mean, I might as well have been Marcus Dupree running out to the field, you know, ready to carry the ball. And so I run out on this field and for the first day of practice, and someone throws me a football. Just, you know, everybody's kind of just getting used to things and just warming up. And I had a friend at the time I'd grown up with by the name of Mark January. Now, Mark January was one of those kids that developed early. He was a big kid, and he was fast, and he was a great athlete for many years. He was kind of the best athlete I knew and the best athlete in our school. And as this ball's coming in the air, you know, and I'm seeing, you know, all the plays I've watched my beloved Sooners, you know, accomplish over the years, I catch this ball and he levels me. And we're not playing, you know, we're just messing around out there, and he knocks me over, and I fall into this mud and dirt, and I get up, and my, you know, this emerald uniform I'm so proud of is now like coated in mud. And I'm furious, and I can't remember what I said to him, but I remember him turning to me and saying, like, Quinn, this is football. And I thought to myself, yeah, I mean, I guess it is, and we haven't even had a practice yet. So there were some signs early on that football might not be in my future. I also remember somehow I secured the starting quarterback spot in junior high, and it certainly was not because of talent. I think it was just that there was no one else that could do it. And I remember we played a team, and I'm up at the line of scrimmage, and we're playing kind of the best team in the city, and they're all lined up on the line, and I'm under center, you know, and I'm calling out the play, and whatever the play is, it doesn't involve me, and I can't get the ball out of my hands fast enough. And it's a quick pitch, right or left or something. And all the defensive linemen who knew me from basketball primarily were talking at the line of scrimmage about, like, we're coming, Murphy, we're coming. And I'm like, I'm getting rid of this football before you come. I promise you that. So I decided not long after junior high that I would start focusing on the game of basketball. It was better suited for me, and I was a tall, skinny kid at the time, and I decided to leave football behind and start working on basketball. But what I learned from football were two things. One is some of the tougher kids in football loved the contact, and it wasn't tied to their size. I mean, you could have some small kid out there that would run through a brick wall and loved it. And I'm twice his size. I hated it. And so I learned that some of the tougher kids I knew loved the contact, and I was not one of those kids. So when I decided to go into basketball, I had already made my mind up and realized maybe subconsciously that I wasn't the toughest kid in the school, and basketball was better suited. And so I go into basketball, I have some success, and we end up moving on to high school, and I go to a school called Parkview. And Parkview was a good school at the time. All my friends came up with me. I was excited about basketball and playing basketball there. But I still hadn't grown. And my biggest challenge, looking back on it, was that I was really a smart mouth. And I mean, just that kid that just wouldn't shut up. And I remember there was a time that we were at lunch at Parkview, and we were outside the building, and I was doing something annoying to this kid, and he came up and he pushed me. And, I'd been in some minor scraps, but nothing too big. And I certainly was not a fighter, and had never gotten to this point before. And so he pushed me again. And he just kept pushing me over and over and over. And my recollection is the guy pushed me 20 times. He was effectively calling my bluff. And he was saying I'm here, you talk all this smack, what are you going to do about it? And the answer was I wasn't going to do anything about it. And the reason I wasn't going to do anything about it is I just was not that physically tough. And I remember growing up that was a realization that incident had emphasized to me. And so, I end up having a good career and playing basketball in college. And I meet my wife, Michelle, and Michelle is from Chicago. And so every summer she goes back home and I stay in Springfield, and, we try and earn a little money in the summers. And, I remember my way of earning money was either asking my parents for some to fill my gas tank, or working basketball camps, which was a lot easier than what my wife chose to do. So my wife comes from a family, I told you I'm a family of artists and musicians. My wife's from a very blue-collar family. Her mother was a high school secretary, and her father was a GM mechanic, so she knew how to work. And she would go home to Chicago in the summers. And I remember one summer she got a job on a manufacturing line putting soup labels on cans over and over and over. And I just at the time couldn't imagine it. How on earth do you do that all day long? And she was telling me I'm trying to pick up extra hours, 50 hours, not 40. And I remember thinking man, she is a mentally tough person. And about that time I started to decide maybe I wasn't. So I'd kind of reached two conclusions towards the end of college, and that was that I was not particularly tough physically or mentally, which is not, in the end, makes a big difference in the story that I have to tell you this morning. But we got through it together and moved up to St. Louis and had kids and were married, and life was going well for me, which brings me really to my first encounter with the world's most incurable disease, cancer. So in 2017, after we'd moved across the river, I was running, and we live in Columbia, Illinois, and Columbia is a small town, kind of a rural community, and we lived in a subdivision, and there are a bunch of different places to run over in Illinois, southern Illinois. Sometimes you can take runs through cornfields, and that's kind of fun, but to mix it up, sometimes we would run these back roads that took us out by a really, really old cemetery up on a hill. And I remember this one morning before I was going to work, I decided to go get a run in, and I'm jogging up by this cemetery. And it's 6:30 in the morning, it's fall, it's kind of cold, and I'm, you're sweating and coughing and spitting, just getting things rolling in the morning. And I noticed for some reason when I spit on the ground, there was this little tinge of almost like rust color. I didn't think it was blood at the time, but it struck me as odd, and I specifically remember looking at it and noticing it. And then I also remember kind of having this kind of cough that it was like a tickle in the back of my throat, and it just wouldn't go away, no matter how much I coughed. But I mean, at the time I was, lifting weights and running, doing some boxing and kickboxing at that time just for exercise. So I felt like I was in good shape. I thought maybe my mouthpiece or something had cut the inside of my mouth. I felt great, no problem. So I just kind of blew it off and moved on. But the cough kind of wouldn't go away. And so I decided that I will go to my primary care physician, and I will see what he has to say, see if he'll give me like a Z-Pack or something. I thought maybe I have some bronchitis. So I did, and I went to him, and he did all the stuff with listening to my lungs and all that, and he gives me a Z-Pack, and I go on my way. And I go home, I take the Z-Pack, I feel better, wasn't coughing quite as much, and didn't really have too much of a tickle in my throat for a couple weeks. And then a couple weeks later it returns. And I just remember thinking never really had that before. I think I better go back to him and just make sure that I got the right medicine or whatnot. And again, all this while I'm running, lifting weights. I mean, I'm very active, playing basketball with my son, coaching him. I mean, I feel fine. And so I go back to him, and he again, takes a look at my chest, listens to my chest, and he says, I think I'm going to send you for an x-ray of your chest just to rule out, I don't know, pneumonia or something like that. So I'm like, sure, no problem. So I go down the street, and we take this x-ray. And he may have taken an MRI at the same time of my chest. I'm not really sure, but I know we've got some folks that played sports or athletes here, and you've probably been, maybe many of you have been through MRIs. You kind of go through this scanning thing, and then you sit out in the waiting room and you wait for them. And it seems like for a long time you wait for them. And so we do this MRI, and I'm by myself, and I'm sitting in the waiting room waiting, and it goes on and on and on and on. And finally, the technician comes out and he says, Mr. Murphy, I've got your MRI, I've got your x-ray, and I've sent it on to your primary care physician. And I said, okay, well, what did it show? And he said, well, your physician's going to call you. And I said, well, that's fine. I'll talk to him, but what did it show? And he said, no, he's going to call you. And I knew something was wrong. He wouldn't tell me what it showed. And I said, no, I'm not waiting for him to call me. I drove right down the street, and I went right in the office to my primary care physician. And I said, I need to see him, and I need to see him now. And fortunately, he got me in, and we sat down in his office, and he said, I'm looking at your x-ray here. He put the x-ray up on one of those bright screens, and he said, there is this massive right body in your right lung. There's a mass of something in your right lung. And I said, well, what is it? And he said, well, it's as big as a baseball or even possibly a softball. And all my x-rays show is that it is there, and it's out towards the bottom of your lung. And I said, well, what could it be? And he said, of course, well, obviously it could be cancer, but, it could be a number of different things. We don't really know until we do some additional tests. So, at that point, I'm really freaked out, and, let's do the tests. Let's get them going. So we schedule these tests, and over the next 2 weeks, I do what felt like just an eternity of biopsies and scans and tests. And I remember it all culminated in a trip to a specialist's office where we sat in a dark room to talk about and show me the scans that they'd done of my chest cavity. And what she told me was, we did some scans on you a couple weeks back, and we fed your body with sugar, and cancer loves sugar. And so then we take a picture, kind of a rolling film of your chest as we go down, and this type of film we use shows nothing but sugar. So if you have cancer, it'll show up as bright lights on this film. And so you don't want to see bright lights. You want it to be dark all the way. And so we start rolling through this thing, and it's like one of those old Hollywood films. It seems like it takes forever, and you think you see a flash here, and she says, no, that's not really it. That's not your it. And we finally get to this screen, and the screen lights up like an explosion of dynamite. This massive lights everywhere, all over my chest. The mass in my right lung was, looked just like, a sun. There were spots elsewhere of light, and she said, this is a cancerous tumor. And through additional tests, we have determined that you have cancer in your lung, you have it in your liver, it's metastasized into your liver, kidney, gallbladder, and bloodstream. And because of that, at age 45, Mr. Murphy, you have stage 4 fully metastasized cancer, and I can't believe it. I just can't believe it. It can't be right. That's what I remember thinking. I don't know anything about cancer at that time. I don't have any cancer in my family at that time. What I know about cancer is you don't beat it. And if you do, you're one of those rare physical, mentally strong people. I just told you I already knew I wasn't. So I'm scared. I got teenage kids. I don't know where to go from here, right? And so I talked with my wife. I mean, it was really a tough conversation, obviously, with her, and we're trying to figure out what we're going to do about it, and they're talking treatment options. And I remember for 3 days following that prognosis, I really experienced kind of a different depth of fear. We've all been afraid of things in life, but that was different. It was like almost at that time, I just felt like this hopeless, I have to start thinking about things I've never thought about. I have to start planning things I've got these young kids. I always wanted to be there for them during high school because that's tough, and just really, really fatiguing depth of fear for 3 full days. And I remember I would get up in the morning and I would sit at my couch and I would drink coffee. And I've always been kind of the earliest riser in my family. And so it would usually just be me or maybe me and my dog Peso. And we'd sit there and I'd pray about it. And for these 3 days, I just kept praying. And then I remember I'm sitting on the couch one morning on day 3, and I remember an account in the Bible. It pops into my head that God had actually changed his mind. And I went back and I remember reading in Exodus 32 that God was angry with Israel for worshiping idols and was going to destroy them. But Moses argued to God that his reputation would be hurt by doing so. And the Bible actually said God changed his mind. And I remember thinking, man, maybe I can change his mind. Maybe if my destiny was to die of cancer, maybe I can make a compelling argument. I mean, here I am, a lawyer, always think in this direction anyway. Maybe I can argue to God that you shouldn't let me die of cancer, that I can do better things for you if you let me live. And so I prayed to him that day, and I asked him for really 2 things. And I asked him, the first thing I asked was that he would heal me from cancer. And I remember thinking, I've got a big God, I'm asking big things. I'm not going to ask that he, make this a process that's easy on me or that he extend I'm going to ask him flat out, I want you to heal my cancer. He can handle it. And so that was one thing I asked. But acknowledging that I didn't really know for sure what his intent was for me, my second prayer was that if I was going to die of cancer, that I would walk that walk in a way that even when I was gone, my kids would know he was real. And that the way that I'd lived during that time period would be my testimony to my children even after I'd passed. That's what I wanted. And I remember I prayed this prayer, and I started thinking to myself, I've been in church for years, right? I mean, I've read the stories, I've heard sermons about the mighty things that God has done. I mean, we serve a really, really big God. This is nothing. Like my cancer for the God that can do the things we read about in the Bible is nothing. Nothing. And I started to, instead of looking and comparing what I needed to happen to me to what I could do and what the doctors could do, I started to compare that to what God could do. And it became so small, like just a small thing. And I remember the thought popped into my head after I prayed, and I was thinking about these things it was in the morning, and I'm all by myself, and it was like, what are you doing? I mean, do you believe or you not? You've gone to church your whole life. You've seen what God's done in people's lives. And I remember thinking, if you believe, quit acting like you're afraid and start believing. And if you don't believe, then quit going to church and reading your Bible and praying because you don't believe anyway. What's the point? And I was at a crossroads, right? I had to make up my mind. Yes or no. It was right there that morning. I could see it like we're there right now, sitting on a brown couch. Do I believe or do you not believe? Yes or no. It's simple. And I did. I believed. And the accounts in the Bible, I could not believe that God was going to take me through this thing. And so that morning, I just turned it over to him. I prayed for the two things. And it was the strangest thing. Like from that morning on, I never feared again. Ever. It was weird. I mean, you read about these accounts in the Bible of people that do mighty things, and you think, oh, they're so brave. How did they do? I mean, I can tell you I've lived through something like this. And the way that you live through it is God just takes the fear that's in your body and it's just gone. I couldn't even put myself psychologically in a place of fear. I remember thinking, maybe I ought to do some planning. This was after this prayer. Maybe I ought to do some planning. I mean, I need to get a will in place. I got to get, the decisions about, kids and custody and how assets are going to be transferred. And it was the weirdest thing because my mind would not go there. It was almost like something, God just sealed off that tunnel of my mind and was just like, yeah, you're not doing that. Don't worry about it. And I'd think, man, I got to make some plans. And the minute I would start making some plans, it was as if there was just a wall erected that just said, no. You don't need to make plans. And so here I am, and I'm feeling like all of a sudden, I just knew I'm going to beat this thing. And I can't explain it to you. I can't explain to you why I wasn't afraid of it. I had no fear of it. God just for that period started to walk with me every single day. And I can tell you it is a powerful thing to walk with God. It's a weird thing to walk with God. You're not afraid of things you should be afraid of or that most people would be afraid of. You're not down. You're not sad. You're not trudging forward through a challenge. I can tell you, as strange as it sounds, it was the greatest time of my entire life. There's just nothing that compares to walking with God, and he thankfully walked with me during this time period. And so, we headed into the medical folks wanted to do 12 rounds of chemo, so I did 12 rounds of chemo. And I remember the oncologist sat there and he said, he told us what I have, how we're going to treat it, what cocktail they're going to use. And he said, I want to talk to you about survival percentages. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really want to hear about those. And he's like, I understand, but I want to tell you about them so that you can make educated decisions. And I said, no, I'm not going to hear them, period. My thinking was, if it's God's will that I am healed, then my survival percentage is 100. And that's what I'm going with. So we went with 100. And he never told me. I wouldn't let him tell me. We did chemo. Chemo was tough, but to be honest with you, it was okay. I mean, we got through it. There were some tough times, but it was doable. And I went into surgery, and I did a first surgery where they took out a piece of my kidney. They took out a piece of my liver, and they did a colonectomy. And the weird thing I remember about this surgery was I had done some athletic surgeries when I was in college, and they were all orthoscopic. And I would get out, and, I was thinking like, how marked up am I going to be, right? But I would get out, and there's just these little dots where they went in, with whatever instruments they used to repair a meniscus or whatever the injury might be. And so I guess I assumed that's the way it was going to be with this, and I never really asked. So I didn't really want the details. He's like, let me explain exactly, the surgeon before we did this first surgery, let me explain to you exactly what we're going to do. I'm like, I don't want to know. I mean, what do I trust that you know what you're doing. I'm not okay in it. I am okay in it, but I don't need to know the details. So I kind of thought I'd get out and have a couple dots or an incision here or there. So I go into this first surgery, and I mean, I'm still just trusting God, and I'm not really worried about it at all, and it's a week hospital stay over in Big Barns. I mean, a big thing, and I don't like hospitals, but I got used to them by necessity. I come out of this surgery, and I look down, and I am cut from my chest 45 staples. I mean, I look like Frankenstein. I mean, I've got these metal staples all down my stomach, and how did this happen? I didn't know. I never asked. I was just operating on blind faith. And so I had this big zipper down the front of my stomach, and it took about a month to recover from that surgery, get off the pain pills. And I remember just the week that I recovered in terms of my energy and appetite and everything, and I'm like, oh, I'm finally feeling better. They rushed me in for my second surgery. So the second surgery, I go in and they want to take out the whole bottom half of my right lung, because that's where the tumor was. And so again, I'm just walking, taking it a day at a time at this point in time. And we go in and they they tell me, we got two ways to go in here. We've got a new way where we can kind of go in and pull the tumor out, if it will fit. And if not, then we sort of have to use what amounts to like a car jack and pry your ribs apart and then pull it out. And that's how we used to do them. And you don't want that. That's real bad. It doesn't feel real good. Well, of course, it was too big to come out. So they pry my ribs apart and they pull this out, and I'm there for another week, but they get it. And just about the time that I get to feel, this is towards the end of the year, and I'm feeling better, I get my strength back, and I remember we go back and we visit the oncologist, and I'm thinking, man, we've made it. Like we've actually made it through this. I'm done. It's going to be a new year, a new beginning. And we go in the doctor's office, and he says, yeah, I want to do 12 more rounds of chemo for you. And I'm thinking, man, it just took the wind out of my sails. I just psychologically was past it, and I didn't want to do. He says, to make sure we got everything, we want to do 12 more rounds of chemo. And so we, of course we agree. It's not the sort of thing you turn down. I figured it's probably wise to go ahead and do it. So we did it, and we got through it. And the question the whole time was, are you going to live by faith, or are you going to live in fear? And I had chosen to live in faith. God had given me that choice, I feel. My point in telling you the story about me growing up was that I wasn't a tough kid. I mean, how I lived this was not me. I can't do that. I'm the kid that didn't like getting hit on the football field. I'm the kid that didn't know what to do when the high school kid was pushing me. I'm not inherently a warrior, but I'm telling you, I was a warrior during this. I'd do whatever they wanted to do. I had unlimited ability to just go with God's plan. And we got through it. I felt at the time almost like I was bulletproof. And I felt like God would not let me die, but rather would work this to emphasize himself. So after 12 initial rounds of chemo, 2 major surgeries with 2 one-week hospital stays, another 6 to 12 rounds of chemotherapy, and over a 2-year battle, I was eventually declared cancer-free. And that was a day of celebration for me and my family. And of course, that started a whole nother set of choices about how we were going to live moving forward with what I read to you about. Recurrence risks. We don't worry about it. I don't worry about it at all. I mean, again, it's 100% survival rate. If God was on my side, and he was then, why wouldn't he be now? So I was very thankful for that, which really brings me to kind of the point of what I wanted to talk to you about, which is the 10 things that I learned about God during my battle with stage 4 cancer. Number 1, the first thing. I know we have a lot of football fans in here. I'm a football fan as well. God is good in third and short. God specializes in fourth and long. Okay, he's good in third and short. It is his specialty to capitalize on fourth and long. He has a flair for the dramatic. God is at his very best when the odds are at their very worst. I remember one time before all of this, I was talking with my mom about some problems she was having, and I remember we sat down and we had breakfast, and she was telling me how she just, whatever the situation she was facing, there was just no foreseeable way out. It was just impossible, and I can't remember specifically what she was dealing with, but I remember that there was kind of a despair to her, and she had kind of worked through all the chess pieces, and it was as if someone had declared checkmate or check and checkmate, and she had no pieces left to move. And she said, Quinn, I mean, I just don't know what to do with this. And I remember thinking to myself, perfect. This is great news. You're exactly when God shows up. God shows up when the odds are zero in your mind. God shows up when you can't figure out a way out, when you're struggling. I didn't have stage 1 or 2 cancer, stage 3 cancer. I didn't have stage 4 cancer where the cancer had not gotten into my bloodstream. God showed up at stage 4 fully metastasized cancer in all of my blood, all over my body. And he said, it's no big deal. And I think we should take heart in that. I take heart in that. I think that he opens the door to his mercy whenever our odds are really the very worst. If I had had stage 1 cancer and the medicine had handled it independently, would I be here talking today? Would you be listening? Would I have a story to tell? Would we be celebrating what God had done in my life if I had had a curable or treatable form of cancer? I don't know that we know those questions, but I do know that there is no doubt, and I am living proof, that God specializes in fourth and long. Number 2, God only asks of us 2 things. Number 1 is use the gifts that he's already given us. And number 2 is have unconditional faith in him. God gives us a mind and he asks us to use it. In fact, he requires us to use it. I remember when I did my cancer chemotherapy treatment at Siteman Cancer Center, and hopefully none of you have been to a chemotherapy lab or ward, but it's kind of a depressing place. I remember I'd go in there and I was 30 years younger than anybody else doing chemotherapy. And I'm like, how does this happen to me? But you sit around and, you sit in these chairs and there are folks, right, that you're sitting in a big room and there's maybe 10 people doing chemotherapy and some are sleeping and others are there. And every once in a while you'll get by somebody who wants to talk. And I used to sit in the cancer ward and talk with a guy named Bob. And Bob was probably maybe 50. And Bob was desperate. He had been fighting his cancer for a long, long time. And the chemotherapy for Bob was barely keeping it at an acceptable level. And I remember Bob told me once, he said, what are you doing? What are you going to do to beat this thing? Well, first of all, he asked me, are you going to fight it? And I'm thinking as opposed to what? Yeah, I'm going to fight it. And he said, I'm trying, but I've tried everything. And I'm thinking well, maybe this kind of opens the door. What have you tried? And he started listing off these things that he had tried, and it was bizarre. I remember specifically the last thing he said was that he contacted someone who had brought some fine sand from the Jordan River, and he had swallowed it. And I'm like, well, what do you say to that? He said, and it's done nothing. It's done nothing. I'm like, yeah, I'm sure it has, Bob. But I think, we all know that God can treat and cure cancer through anything he wants, including nothing. The example I always used was that God could cure my cancer, stage 4, with lemon peels, if that's what he so chose. But at the end of the day, guess what God uses a lot? Chemotherapy, medicine, nutrition. Use your head. I think God requires us to use our head in these things and not to just overcomplicate things. Use your head, leave the rest up to God, was my number 2. Number 3, this is a really important one. God cares enough about our faith to shine a light on our darkest crevices during times of great challenge. We all hide areas of our life from God. It's hard not to. Sometimes we do it knowingly, and sometimes we don't do it knowingly at all. We don't even know we're hiding them. It would be easy for God to smooth out the rough edges of our lives and say, he's not that bad, check him out, leave us be. But that isn't enough for God. God wants more out of us. God wants a stronger relationship with us than just smooth edges and a not that bad prognosis. God wants us to experience trust and faith in him at the highest possible spiritual level. And God is not going to let us hiding our weaknesses or our sins or areas of our life that we don't want him to know about because we're not proud about. He's not going to allow that to interrupt the relationship he wants to have with us. You know, I remember when I got cancer, my life at that point, up to that point, had been pretty good, guys. I'd had experience in athletics. I'd succeeded. I'd gotten my MBA, done well in school, gotten my law degree, done great, won some trials. Like everything was going right on path. I had no idea that my biggest problem was I was just a little too proud of that. I had a ton of pride. That was what I was hiding way back under the crevice. I remember thinking one morning, my problem is that I think God's given me these talents when he's really rented me these talents. You see what I'm saying? He can take them back anytime he wants. These aren't mine inherently. Things I've done in my life aren't mine to own. They're God's to have leased to me. And he can recall them whenever he wants to recall them. And God took my pride in my physical strength and my pride in maybe intellectual or strength, and he reduced it all down to nothing through stage 4 cancer to show that what I really need is him, not them. And I'm thankful that God cares enough about our faith to shine his light in our darkest crevices, number 3. Number 4, God doesn't feel compelled to tell us the method to his madness. Okay? Don't waste a lot of time on the why of the challenges of your life. Don't try and figure out why God does his work. His work, he does. Period. A lot of the people in the chemotherapy labs that I sat in spent the whole afternoon questioning why. Our questions why are normally us questioning God's judgment. They're saying we know better. They're a waste of spiritual energy. And if you really think about it, they are a form of insubordination to God. So number 4 for me was, don't necessarily ask yourself why. One of the things I remember thinking was the story of Job. And, here's Job, and he's going through all these physical and emotional hardships, and Satan tells God, if you take away your blessings to him, he'll curse you to your face. The only reason why he loves you, God, is because of, what you've given him, and God allows him to strip him of those things, and they go back and forth, and eventually we wind up in one of my favorite scriptures, which is Job 38, where God basically just lays down the law to him. If you're ever depressed, read Job 38. You're not going to get any things told to you. You're just going to get questions you can't answer, which is what happened with Job. It's a phenomenal book that I read every once in a while. But, basically God asked him all these questions that were tantamount to, you don't know, I know. But what he didn't do that I would have done is I would have just said, oh, and by the way, listen, I had this bet with Satan. I had to pull that stuff from you. I love you, but here is why I did that to you. He never tells him why. The why was so easy. God doesn't have to tell us why. He doesn't feel compelled to tell us why. He didn't need to tell me why I got cancer. What I needed to do is trust that he had a reason and that he would see me through it. God controls everything, including cancer, and our why usually doesn't move the ball forward in our relationship with him. Number 5, sometimes we need Christ the Lamb, sometimes we need Christ the Lion. We all talk about and are familiar with Christ as the sacrificial Lamb of God, and I think we're all thankful for that. Sometimes I remember in my battle with cancer, this thought popped into my head that he's also the lion, right? He's as much the lion as he is the lamb. And I'm dealing with cancer, and with all respect, I need a lion right now. I need a warrior. I need my warrior God to show up in this instance. I need Jesus the lion to show up. And I remembered in Proverbs 30:30, it says, the lion which is mightiest among beasts does not turn back before any. And I would read scriptures like that, and I would think, man, that's what I need. Isaiah 31, for the Lord said to me, as a lion or young lion growls over its food, and when a band of shepherds is called, and against him he is not terrified by their shouting or noise, so the Lord of hosts will come down to fight on Mount Zion and on its hill. And I remember just thinking like, man, I've never really thought about Jesus as a lion, but that's what I needed at the time, which is why I ended up naming my blog post Lion Strong, because I just felt like with God by my side, I was strong like a lion or lion strong. So I'm thankful that we have both Christ the Lamb and also Christ the Lion. Number 6, the reservoirs of God's love and mercy do not have a bottom. Okay? I grew up in Springfield, as I was telling you. There's a river there, the James River. In the James River, there are areas that are, I think I was baptized in the James River, but there are areas that are really deep and areas that are real shallow. And there was this area that was real deep that had a rope swing. And you'd swim across this river and you'd climb up the bank, and it was kind of muddy and you hope not to slip. And you'd get as high as you could on this bank, and you would grab this rope and you would swing out and you would let go at the top of the point. And the whole goal was to try and enter your body as narrow as you could through the water, so you could get down to the bottom, touch it, and push yourself back up. It was always the goal when we used this rope swing. But the weirdest thing, I don't know how deep this river was at this place, but you could never find the bottom. You would run out of oxygen trying to swim towards the bottom, and at some point you'd realize, I can't really hit the bottom and push up, so I need to stop and start, paddling my way back up for air, or else you would run out. God's mercy for us and his love for us also don't have a bottom. There is no way to exhaust what he has for us in terms of mercy and sustaining grace. And cancer was really a big eye-opener for me in that regard. Number 7, God demands and deserves credit for the work he does in our lives. Now this one I'm going to tread a little thin here on Valentine's Day. My lovely wife, at New Year's Eve, brought out a exercise chart for she and I. And what it is it's the names of every single month, January, February, March, and on down. And each letter of the word is a number of the days of the month. So, on the first day of February, the F may have February 1, 2, 3, and you color in the day if you exercise that day. And the goal is to get them all filled in. What I started to notice is that my lovely wife would take days off if the square of the day was small. But she didn't want to take it off if you got to color in a big part of the letter. Why? Because she wanted credit. There's doing the work, and then there's getting credit for the work. We want both, and she deserved the credit for the work. She had done it. God is the same way. God wants credit, our credit, for the work that he has done. And he deserves that credit because he has done that work. So, I ended up thinking that if you fight for God's reputation, if you fight with God, and you give God the credit along the way, you've aligned your life with God's will, and you can't lose. And so my 7th point was that he demands credit for the work he's performed in our life, which is one of the reasons why I speak to groups like this. Number 8, with God, how you fight is always more important than whether you win. I had a conversation with my kids when we came home, and I had to tell them about cancer, and we were sitting out back on my patio deck, and it was the toughest conversation I've ever had in my life. Here I have these young kids. I mean, they're 10 and 8 or something like that, and we're sitting out there, and I've got to tell them their dad has allegedly incurable stage 4 cancer. And we had this conversation with them, and my son was young enough, I don't know that he really grasped it. My daughter started to cry, and I mean, daughters and dads, that's just cut me deep, but we ended up telling them, and we decided we were going to tell them everything. And I remember telling them, we have a big God, we're going to ask him to do big things. And then we're going to believe that he's going to do those big things. And so we did. And we decided that we were going to live in a spirit of gratitude and optimism throughout my process, and we did. And to be honest with you, God gave us that gift But we were able to move forward, and people afterwards would say, well, how are your kids doing? The kids are doing fine. Why? They believe I'm going to beat it. That's why. And that was a gift that God gave us, and he gave me the ability to fight it in a good way and to fight the good fight, which is always more important than the ultimate outcome. Number 9, the path of God's people is filled with challenge by design. God says in the Bible, in this world, you will have tribulation. Our world is full of tribulation. We should expect it. Christ loved the apostles, and he knew he would be leaving all of them before he went up to heaven. And yet he prayed, one of his last prayers before he ascended into heaven was that God would take care of the apostles, and he specifically said, I pray not that you would take them out of this world. I always found that so remarkable. I mean, here he is, he spent all this time with these guys, he loves them beyond measure, he's going to miss them, he cares for them, would give his life for them, has given his life for them. And I put myself in that position, and I'm going on a trip. The last thing I'm going to pray is, God, don't let them come with me. I'm going to say, bring them with me, right? I love these people. His design was not that they come with him. His design for us is that we live in the world where he says we will have tribulation. It's not an accident when we face challenge. It's simply what Christ has promised us we will encounter. The Christian walk is not a goal of surviving challenge until you can get back on path. The challenge is the path of the Christian walk. And finally, number 10, the hardest part of walking with God through challenge is what comes after you survive it. With cancer, I woke up every single morning with one enemy, cancer. I have to beat cancer. Life was easy. I had one goal, do everything in my power to just live and beat cancer. Life after cancer is a lot harder. It's not deep cuts, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. You would think someone who had survived stage 4 cancer would have an easier time of keeping the perspective that I had during cancer. It's hard. I get worked up over the same stuff I got worked up over, before I had cancer. It's hard for me, and it's hard for us to maintain the closeness with God that we experienced during that time period, and I miss it. I miss it a great deal. But the key, I believe, is to embrace our dependence on God during the times of prosperity and not just challenge. God's gift to us God's greatest gift to us is the spirit of gratitude, and we have to live that every single day. So in closing, what's going to be your cancer? What are you going to encounter? What will be your challenge? Illness? Death of a loved one? Economic hardship? Damage to your reputation? A devastating injury? What about children? Those are my weakness, my kids. What if you lose a kid? What if your kids suffer hardship? Unfairness to your children. We will all have some form of cancer during our lifetimes. But don't forget, God told us, in this world you will have tribulation. But if there's one thing that I learned from my bout with cancer, it's that Christ's proclamation is also true to be of good cheer. For our mighty lion has overcome.